The most important part to any zoo is the animals in the enclosures they call home. Throughout the series, I'll be designing different enclosures for an array of animals, whilst also keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Join me each week as I tackle a new enclosure and idea and try and bring it to life within Planet Zoo. Today I will be building a grizzly bear enclosure. The design I have come up with is what I believe a bear enclosure would look like. I wanted to make the build as dense as possible, but not too dense so that the guests could still see the animal. Here are the stats for a grizzly bear. With this being my first North America animal, I want to make it a really big enclosure with lots of space for the animal to roam. First thing I wanted to do was build a ditch. So this involved sort of lowering the ground and working out a sort of decent size that I wanted the enclosure to be. As you can see here, there is a lot of faffing about trying to get the right shape and trying to get it all level. I knew I wanted to edge it all off with a border, which you'll see a little bit later on. I use a wall and roof tiles to sort of fence off the enclosure and give it that really box shape. Once I had finished doing that, I needed to build a ramp so that obviously the bear could get in and out from the lower bit of the enclosure to where the house was going to go. Now I am just working out the rough edges of the enclosure using this wall texture to really sort of give the enclosure a nice sharp edge, and so that it tidies up that muddy slope given from the ditch. Now I'm placing a fence around the edge of the enclosure. This is just to add some height and also keep guests out. To start with, I was doing this really complex, really fiddly way to build, and it was just taking up way too much time. So a little while later on, I switch it up and just sort of change the way I'm building this fence. Otherwise, I knew I'd be here for a very long time, considering it takes up 3 walls of the enclosure. With the fence nearing completion, it was time to make a start on the bear house itself. I was kind of making this idea up as I went along, and as you'll see, I decided to split the house across the middle section at the top here. So this is one half of the house being built here. I'm just sort of laying it out and where I want things to go. And then across from this, I also build the other half of the house so that the bear has 2 different places to go. The gap there in the wall at the back is obviously to add a keeper gate so that keepers have access, which you will see I'm doing here. I'm just adding the final little bits to the house itself, as you can see here, and then I decided it was time to sort of fill that big empty mud patch, and I knew I wanted a water feature. Even though it wasn't really necessary in the enclosure, I felt like it was the right thing to do. I didn't want all the walls to be completely bare, so here I am adding my favourite thing, rock work, to the enclosure just to really pad it out and add that texture, with the main thing being trees and rock work for most enclosures. It's a nice easy thing to add and also brings a pop of colour to every enclosure I build. Now came a really fiddly part of the build. Placing the gate wasn't the problem. It was adding the knoll barriers around the edge of the enclosure, and as you can see, I've left gaps there for windows, which I later put in one-way glass. And as you'll see, I had to completely change what I'd done because it just wasn't aligning with the bear house itself. So this was definitely a very fiddly part of the build. It also didn't help that it's quite a big enclosure and just trying to get all the sizes right. So yeah, it was definitely very difficult, and all of this had to be changed because it just wasn't going to work the way I wanted it to. The bear is currently being transported into the enclosure itself, which you can see, and this is where I realised I'd left these blank, and I was trying to desperately fill these gaps so that the bear couldn't escape, and this was just a lot of fiddling, a lot of wasted time, just trying to get it right, and also so it looked flush with the wall itself. Once I'd mastered that part of the build, I was very happy with it and glad to be done with it, and didn't want to fiddle with it any more than I already had done. Now came the final part of the build, filling in the enclosure itself. Here I am adding loads of different textures, which I started with a long grass, and I later changed this to sort of rock, just to add different textures within the enclosure itself. As you can see, I'm doing that now. Next came adding trees and climbable objects for the bear, just to really fill in that enclosure like I wanted, and make sure that it really was as dense as I hoped for, whilst also leaving enough gaps for the guests to see the bear itself. And I guess the best way of doing that was by having this ditch in the first place, because it really sort of elevated the guests above the bear itself, and really made use of the space. To add to the denseness of the build, I placed loads of foliage on the ground. There's also some tree stumps, which you can see there. This was just to add some different textures to the ground of the enclosure. And the whole time I'm going at sort of guest level to see what they can see from their point of view. To finish off the build, I was adding the finishing touches like the feeding station, water station, and plenty of playable equipment slash enrichment for the bear, and really making use of all that space within the enclosure so that it had loads of things to do, and just really brought it to the guests' attention when they are standing around the edge watching the bear. Overall, I'm really happy with this build, and I enjoyed building at a different level this time by lowering the enclosure and adding that extra depth for guests to see. And here is the final result.